Hello, everyone. We're going to discuss body composition, understanding what it is and how to measure it. First of all, what is body composition? Well, it's simply a breakdown of your total body weight into what is fat mass, bone mass, and everything else, which comprises your total lean mass, the mass of your essential organs and your muscles. And it's different than body weight, which is what we measure when we stand on a typical bathroom scale. This picture is a nice illustration of the difference between body weight and body composition. Two women can have identical total body weights, but very different body compositions. The woman on the left in this picture has a lot more body fat and less muscle mass than the woman on the right, who has a lot more muscle mass and a lot less body fat, even though they weigh the same. So when we weigh ourselves on a bathroom scale, we're not getting a true representation of what our body weight comprises. Well, why do we care? It's easy to overinterpret our weight on a scale, especially if we're working hard to gain muscle. It's hard to understand whether or not the changes we see on the scale reflect body fat or body muscle. Meanwhile, we know that having low muscle mass predisposes to a slowdown in our metabolism, which accelerates fat gain, predisposes us to resistance to the hormone insulin, and therefore eventually to diabetes, as well as predisposes to low bone mass because muscle and bone trend together in terms of the mass over time, and we lose both as we age. Which predisposes to osteoporosis and fragility fractures. Ultimately, if we lose enough muscle mass over time in our older age, we become frail, we lose strength, and this leads to loss of functional independence. So clearly, we're invested in the process of at least preserving our muscle mass and ideally building it, because you can never have too much. We also care about how much of our body weight is coming from body fat, because high fat mass is a well-established risk factor for a variety of diseases, including cardiovascular disease, insulin resistance and diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. But we're going to learn a little bit about how not all body fat is the same. So body fat has different components to it, and we can only divide our body fat into these components by looking at a specialized analysis of our body composition. So now, how do we measure body composition? Clearly, it's not enough to stand on a bathroom scale, a typical bathroom scale. There are a number of different technologies and methodologies out there. The first one is called dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, which is short form DEXA. And that is the gold standard and the test that we're going to discuss in more detail. But there are other methods, including bioelectrical impedance analysis, which is the technology used in scales that you can buy for home use and those that appear in most commercial gyms. You can obtain skin fold measurements. You can go underwater weighing using hydrostatic weighing technology, air displacement, plethysmography, something called BODPOD, and you can undergo CT or MRI. Now, those last three are not typically in widespread use at all. And we're going to, like I say, dive more into DEXA scans because they are considered the gold standard for measuring body composition. They're also easy, fast, and accessible. So most centers will offer them if you book an appointment. Now, they're not covered by provincial healthcare plans here in Canada. I'm pretty sure that in most cases you have to pay out of pocket, and they can get quite expensive. I know here in Ottawa, the local Merivale Medical Imaging is charging $250 for one of these scans, and they take 10 minutes, and they are an X-ray based technology, so they do expose you to a very, very minuscule amount of X-ray radiation, which is about equivalent to that you would get in a chest X-ray and much less than in a mammogram. So it's low risk and accessible. And now let's take a look at what you get in the report. Number one, you get a readout of your total bone mass. This is not diagnostic of osteoporosis or low bone mass, as it is predictive for your risk of fracture. Okay, it gives you a bone mineral density for the total body without looking segmentally at the lumbar spine or the hip. And those regions are the ones for which we have normative data and for which we can use diagnostically to say you either have low bone mass or osteoporosis and stratify you in terms of your risk for fragility fractures down the road. This test, the DEXA, will give you a total body bone mass score and a bone mineral density score, and it will calculate something called the T-score and the Z-score. Without going into too much detail, these are scores that compare you to age-matched controls, in the case of a Z-score, and young, healthy, gender-matched controls. And so if these scores, the important thing to know is that if these scores are not negative, then you likely do not need to concern yourself by going further into an analysis of your bone density at the low spine, the lumbar spine, or the hip. If, on the other hand, your total bone mineral density, by DEXA is in the negatives, or in either, mainly in the T-score, but especially in the Z-score, it would call for a need to go get a bone mineral density, which is very similar to a DEXA, but looks, again, regionally at your bone mineral density and allows clinicians to stratify your risk and determine whether therapy for bone loss is needed. Let's now take a look more at fat mass. What do we know from the readout of a DEXA scan? This is a section of the DEXA scan that gives you some data. Your total mass in kilograms is there, along with that which is coming from your fat in grams, okay? So you can determine your total body fat in grams. You can also, in most circumstances, not all centers do this, they give you a readout of your visceral adipose tissue. So that is a compartment of your body fat located in and around your visceral organs. And this is important for reasons that I'll get into in a moment, but it also then calculates your body fat percentage, okay? And all of those numbers become useful, and as we'll see. So what is this visceral adipose tissue? Why should we be concerned about it? It's fat tissue that has effectively spilled out of the subcutaneous fat cells and into and around our essential organs, the liver, the heart, the kidneys, the bowels. It's located in the abdominal cavity. This happens when body fat accumulation exceeds what our body's genetic capacity is for storing fat in fat cells under the skin, otherwise called subcutaneous fat stores. That's where body fat is stored, until which time we supersede the capacity, almost like a bathtub that's overflowed. Some people have smaller bathtubs than others, and so genetically they're more predisposed to store fat in this visceral space at a lower percentage of body fat compared to other people. So your total body fat percentage by itself doesn't give you a sense of whether you have visceral adipose tissue unless your DEXA scan is specifically measuring that. And this is the adipose tissue, or the fat tissue, that's of medical concern. We know now that subcutaneous fat stored in fat cells underneath the skin, while it may not be aesthetically pleasing to you, we know it doesn't pose the health risk that visceral adipose tissue does. Having too much visceral adipose tissue really increases your risk of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, neurodegenerative disease, and cancer. So the leading killers of modern day. And that's because that fat is known to predispose to, or it's a signal that you're developing insulin resistance, particularly when your liver is full of fat, which they can see on a liver ultrasound, and sometimes is evident in blood work. But also, it's a sign that you're developing, so that's an inflammatory condition. So when fat is in those places, it generates a lot of inflammation, which then also predisposes to fat retention. So breaking fat down is impaired in the face of inflammation, as is your responsiveness to the hormone insulin, which then limits how well so encourages fat storage and limits fat breakdown. So that fat in this area can really make fat loss a challenge. And we're going to talk in future sessions on how to address this. But suffice it to say, this kind of body fat is of health concern. So we should be concerned about it. It's not just an aesthetic issue. Let's take a closer look at our lean tissue compartment on the DEXA scan. We talked about how we get a readout of bone mass, fat mass, and everything else is then your lean tissue. It's also your body water and the contents of your digestive tract. So if you happen to be recently fed and have a lot of fluid in your body, you're going to have a different or an elevated lean tissue readout than if you're dehydrated and haven't eaten or you're fasted. This speaks to the importance of having a DEXA scan at the same time of day if you're going to compare readings, okay? So this, the trunk, the part of your body that is your trunk, contains all your essential organs. So the relevant metric that we might be interested in is the appendicular lean mass. That is to say, the lean tissue in your limbs, okay? So when we look at the readout from the DEXA scan, what we're looking at is arms and legs, not trunk, and we're looking over at the column that says lean tissue, not the fat tissue, but the lean tissue. And we simply want to take these grams of lean tissue and add them together and then divide it by our height in meters squared to get what we call the appendicular lean mass index. So I've done that for this particular readout. I've simply taken the lean mass in the arms in grams and added it to the lean mass of the legs in grams, getting me a total in grams. And I convert that to kilograms and divide it by my height in meters squared. And then you get a readout, or a number that is effectively your appendicular lean mass index. The reason we want to get this measurement, we have to do this calculation in order to make meaning and understand how we measure up with our muscle mass compared to age and gender matched controls. And so this comes to the next part of the discussion. How do we interpret the results of our DEXA? So we want to compare our numbers to available normative population data to understand how we measure up and therefore what our risk is. So we want to look at two things. We want to look at our body fat percentage as a whole and compare that to what we know about health risks, and specifically look at whether we have excess visceral adipose tissue. And then secondarily, we want to use that appendicular lean mass index and see how we measure up for our muscle mass. So in terms of looking at our body fat percentage, we want to make sure we're looking at age and gender matched control. So this is a table of body fat percentage in women because it's different in men. And we want to make sure that we have something adjusted for age because as you can see by this chart, what constitutes overfat in an under 20-year-old is actually, by the time you're over 51, considered average, okay? And that's simply because as we age, for a variety of reasons, our natural and normal healthy levels of body fat can go up and not represent a health risk. So we can place ourselves on this chart and determine whether we're lean, we're at an ideal body fat percentage, whether we're average or over fat. Now, average, as you can see, is not necessarily ideal because it simply reflects how we sit in terms of the general population. So we may want to move towards the ideal. We can also use normative data like this one. Across the x-axis is age, and on the y-axis is your body fat percentage. And so using the results of the DEXA in this study, we take someone's age, say 52, we place a vertical post at the age, and then we go to the y-axis and determine the body fat percentage, which in this study was 34%. And change. And where these numbers intersect gives us an idea of where we sit in relative to the population. And you can see this is right on the 50% line. Having a body fat percentage in excess of 90% is very high risk. Somewhere between 50% and 90% would be above average, and we may want to get closer to the midline. Below this is still healthy, but certainly if your body fat percentage falls below the 10th percentile, you may be at risk of other health conditions, right? So we want to be careful not to be too lean, as this can be associated with a lot of body stress and hormone disruption. That topic is another one outside of the scope of this discussion. We can do the same when we look at that visceral adipose tissue measurement. We take the age on the x-axis, we plot our result or our age against our visceral adipose tissue measurement. And then where those intersect give us a sense of where we sit relative to age-matched controls or age-matched populations. And this is mainly derived from Caucasian population. So unfortunately, we don't know how this compares to other racial demographics, but we can see that then if we're at the 50th percentile, the 90th percentile, etc. Now, if your visceral adipose tissue is in excess of this 50th percent, you probably need to really concern yourself with an elevated risk. Below this is probably okay, but honestly, the lower this can be, the better. So really, we should be targeting the very, very lowest for adipose tissue in the visceral space. Then we look at appendicular lean mass, and again, we can use this chart and plot ourselves, and based on age and what our appendicular lean mass index is by DEXA, we can determine where we sit. And again, here, to say that you're okay at 50th percentile is probably not achieving enough. We know that in general, the population, as we get older, gets less and less strong. We want to be, and what I want to be for my women who want muscle, is in the 80th percentile plus. So this is for all comers. If you're regularly lifting weights, you shouldn't be average, you should be above average, well above average. More is always better, just like for visceral adipose tissue, less is always better. So what if we don't want to get a DEXA or we can't get a DEXA? How else can we assess our health risk using some other tools? There are three measurements I want to talk about. One is the BMI, or the body mass index. The second is a waist to hip ratio, and the third is a waist circumference. BMI is something people are usually quite familiar with. It's your total body weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared, and gives you a proportional estimate of fat mass, assuming a constant muscle mass. So that assumption is a big assumption. If you're someone who's been lifting aggressively or has a high muscle mass, this can be very misleading. So you can have a high BMI as a muscular person, and it's not necessarily predictive of risk. So this is where BMI falls short. Likewise, if you're very, very small, like very, very under-muscled, this can also overestimate risk. So it's got its limitations, because we don't know precisely how much of that weight is fat versus muscle, just like for body weight, total body weight. Nonetheless, we have extensive data demonstrating health risk for certain levels of BMI, so it can give you kind of a gestalt of your risk based on your current body mass index. And so this is not divided into gender or age, and so it is somewhat problematic. What we do know from large-scale studies is that in older people, okay, in this study in the Lancet that was in 2017, they looked at a population of 120,000 adults, and 71,000 of them were women whose average age was 51. And they didn't have pre-existing disease at baseline when they were recruited, and they were followed up for a mean of 7 or 10 years, excuse me. So the follow-up period was long, the cohort was large, and they had basically prospective data on who developed one or more indices of disease, including diabetes, coronary heart disease, or stroke. And so if you had one or more of these, you got a tick, and you were considered positive for the development of disease over the follow-up period. And they clearly showed that this, the risk increases, your odds ratio, your odds of developing a disease over that 10-year follow-up period correlated with your BMI. So BMI does tell you something about health risk. We know that from large studies. Of course, its limitations are that it doesn't account for muscularity. It's not adjusted for gender, age, or ethnicity. So even if you're in the normal range, you may miss your risk if you don't look at other indices. And so for this reason, if you're not getting a DEXA, you can use BMI together with these other measures that I'm going to get into next. The next one is the waist to hip ratio. So you can, even if your BMI is in a moderate range, your risk may be increased. And according to the World Health Organization, you should aim for, as a woman, to minimize your risk, a waist to hip ratio of 0.8 or lower. So your waist should be 80% of the width of your hips. Now, again, you know, for myself, I would come out at moderate or high, even based on the genetically how I'm built, with very narrow hips and an extremely and unusually muscular trunk, giving me a large waist circumference. So it's not necessarily by itself a full picture, and you have to take it in context, but this is where you take measurements. So the waist measurement is not the true waist. It's actually at the upper border of your hip bones, your iliac crests here. And you can take a tape measure and measure here, and then the widest dimension, the circumference, of course. We're doing circumferences of the waist and the hips. The hips is measured at the widest point across here. Okay, now finally, you can do a waist circumference. It's a good proxy for your visceral fat. So if your waist circumference is quite expanded, we know that that reflects body fat. It could be in the subcutaneous space, of course, like in your underneath the skin. However, it does correlate and trend with, and therefore is a proxy for, excess visceral adipose tissue, particularly if you are, as a woman, at a waist circumference at or above 88 centimeters. We know this represents a cardiac risk. And in order to know how to measure this accurately, you should follow the instructions on the Heart and Stroke Association website. So now coming back to DEXA, let's say you have one, when do you repeat it? It's very tempting to want to go back and see if a couple weeks of work has yielded results. The reality is, changes in your body composition take much, much longer, and you have to give things time. So our impatience has to be set aside in favor of paying more attention to the effort we're putting into changing. So this comes to my discussion and my repeated messaging around inputs versus outcomes. Yes, it's good to get an outcome measurement, but fixating on that isn't going to move the needle or move the dial. We want to make our focus about our effort or the inputs. And in the next conversation, we're going to talk about where to put that energy, effort, and attention if we want to change what we see on a DEXA. Suffice it to say, the soonest you should repeat it is 9 months, and probably only every year, to see whether you're making changes. And again, ensure that you're doing it at the same time of day so that you're in the same state of fed or fasted and your hydration status is similar.